E Oxalá criou a terra, Oxalá criou o mar, Oxalá criou o mundo, onde reinam os orixás, mas Oxalá criou a terra, Oxalá criou o mar.
Welcome, this is Camila, and I'm here to present you another episode of Podcasting History, a series of stories to give you insights on some of the world's most interesting historical events. This series is brought to you by the Global History team of Minerva Schools at KGI. Today we are going to talk about the unique emergence of religious manifestations in colonial Brazil, spread from the 17th to the 19th century. In a phenomenon that came to be known as syncretism, the many religions matrices that were put together into the mix that Brazil was back then, with Catholic Portuguese colonizers, pagan indigenous natives, and many African religions from the slaves, we could observe the development of brand new forms of religiosity, such as Black Catholic brotherhoods and sisterhoods, Black saints and African religions that appropriated parts of the narratives from Catholicism. Are you ready to dive in? Then come with me and let's get this started. Syncretism, A History of Black Resistance by Camila Loureiro. Imagine you are a slave in Brazil in the 1700s. Your original religion narrates the world being governed by many deities, and all of them have the power to influence directly the natural world. But you are brought to a different continent, forced to work for other men beyond human limits, and you are also required to follow their religion, Catholicism. They teach you their principles, the history of the Bible, the story of creation. You likely miss the freedom and being able to follow your own beliefs. But your masters, the ones that enslave you, have a word for people that do not follow Catholicism: sinners. And those suffer horrible punishments. You wouldn't want that, right? Life is already hard as it is. But then, some people started creating new movements, songs, rituals, saints, all that at the same time could align with the narrative of Catholicism, but incorporated traditional African beliefs. And that made you reconnect with your roots, feel belonging, and also defiant of the order that you live in. This allowed you to feel empowered, even in a slave condition. Surprisingly, this movement went largely unnoticed by the Europeans, that got quite confused with the extensive references to their own traditions. And here is one song for you to see this.
E Oxalá criou a terra, Oxalá criou o mar, Oxalá criou o mundo, onde reinam os orixás, mas Oxalá criou a terra, Oxalá criou o mar.
The origins of this song are unknown, but it traces back to the origins of Umbanda, a religion that unites principles from Catholicism, African religions, and indigenous rituals. Observe how the deity in here, Oxalá, is described similarly to the Catholic God, and it also uses the narrative of how the world was created. An aspect typically Afro-Brazilian in this song is the strong rhythmic beat. Since many of these religions consider dancing to be a sacred thing, for them dancing to these songs is actually dancing with their gods, similarly to praying, and gives them a connection with these entities. So playing and dancing together with these musics is an actually very important ritual. Therefore, from all of this, we can understand that the religious syncretism was an emergent phenomenon in colonial Brazil, and it represented African-Brazilian resistance against European imposition while also striving for self-protection. There are two main visions of what syncretism represents. While some view it as a display of perfect cultural mixture, others argue that it is in fact a symbol of cultural defiance. In many religions that emerged, similar to the example of Umbanda above, it was visible that the long association with Catholicism in Brazil had large impacts, such as the popular identification of Catholic saints and those religions' deities, and the synchronization of their ritual calendars. Prevailing argument nowadays, however, is that syncretism, meaning the synthesis of two different religions, was not a movement of acquiescence, as the colonizers thought it was back in the 17th and 18th centuries, but rather it was the very thing that ensured African identity and belief systems were not annihilated. One author carved the expression "weapons of the weak" to refer to this phenomena, which represents how subaltern and silenced agents in the society used the resources they had to ensure they still had their own say in what cosmology narrative they were using and who were their deities. It is quite naive, however, to think that only Africans were influenced by the pressure of Catholicism. Despite initial attempts to maintain Catholicism pure and traditional, societal pressures were too strong to be resisted. The first signs of incorporation were the emergence of brotherhoods financed by the Church for Black people. The Brotherhood of Our Lady of the Rosary for Black people and the Sisterhood of Our Lady of Boa Morte were some of the largest ones and most impactful. The Brotherhood of Our Lady of the Black people, after several years of saving and internal organization, managed to raise enough funds to build a church destined for Black people. The church of Our Lady of the Rosary for the Black people was a novelty for society back in the 1709, when Black people were forced into Catholicism but didn't have the right to enter the churches frequented by the richer classes in society. This church is highly simple and calvish, especially if contrasted with other churches from the same period that were destined for the elite. There isn't as much gold in the painting of the walls or ceiling, and the mosaics in windows are not as complex. The church has a minimalistic aesthetic. It isn't as much as a choice as it was the only option, given that the intricate decorations, common for the Baroque style of a century, were too expensive for them to afford. This represented, however, a landmark of the beginning of the change in dynamics of how slaves had rights and how the Black people conquested the right to express their religiousness. Another significant change in the perception of the relevance of Black Africans to Brazilian Catholicism was when, after the abolishment of slavery in the late 19th century, the Church started propagating the image of the Black saint that came from Brazilian waters to the hand of a simple man, showing that the protection of Catholicism was for all. This saint, Our Lady of Aparecida, refers to Virgin Mary and is nowadays the patron saint of our country. The Church's decision to reinforce this image was guided by the need to obtain more followers and gain strength, considering that the Brazilian monarchy had just ended along with slavery, and over 50% of the country was African descendant and mixed, a reality that this image accurately depicted. Although the reception of this image was controversial, with overall acceptance from the poorer and Black people, but with resistance and distrust from the white, this symbol became an image of cultural and religious mixture in Brazil. When searching for a narrative of this past, it is quite hard to find a coherent historical analysis. Many authors, mostly in the beginning of the 21st century, analyze individually some manifestations of this phenomenon, such as how certain religions came to be or certain rituals. The fact is that during the 20th century, after the end of slavery and with the establishment of the Republic, the narrative imposed by those who were in power was that there was no such thing as racial prejudice or inequalities of power between different social and religious groups. Just recently, this myth has been debunked, and authors from all over the world turned their attention to this topic. The authors researched to produce this episode are 2 Brazilians and 2 Americans, and the earliest one was produced in 1998. From these authors, there was 1 historian, 2 social anthropologists, and 1 scholar of religiosity and race. Their narratives align a lot on how syncretism has happened, even though each author looked at only one aspect of this phenomenon. Overall, what we could observe from all the examples and scenarios studied today was that in the context of religious imposition, the synthesis that happened between religions from African roots and Catholicism proved to be an assertion of identity, a resource utilized by Africans to resist cultural annihilation without risking worsening their situation as slaves, being a pacific resistance that guaranteed the continuity of their beliefs along with the predominant ones in the society they lived in.
E Oxalá criou a terra, Oxalá criou o mar, Oxalá criou o mundo, onde reinou os orixás, mas Oxalá criou a terra, Oxalá criou o mar.